Okay, got it. It says this meeting is being live streamed.
Yeah, I saw that message on my side.
All right.
It says
So,
meeting is now streaming live on Facebook, it says on my side.
oh, there it is. Okay. 5:27. We have a few minutes for people to get on board. But Tanzanina Kanipuwit Wampaske Mikasumi Guanapio, many blessings to all my relations in the four directions. I am here today, with Russ Diabo, a very well-versed, well-known political analyst and strategist. And, you've been in the game for a long time, and you've had so much to contribute with respect to the mechanisms of colonial history and the impoverishment of our people. So it's an honor to share space with you right now. And I hope we could do more educational, shows like this in the future. Just to, we need ways to empower our people and help bring us out of economic disparity, which I know is occurring all across Turtle Island. So thank you. Could you give a brief introduction of yourself, Russ?
Sure. My name is Russ Diabo. I'm a member of the Mohawk Nation at Kahnawake, which is in Quebec. I grew up in the U.S. side. I'm a son of a Mohawk iron worker. Lived in Brooklyn as a kid. I was born in Erie, Pennsylvania, so I lived in the Northeast pretty much all my life. And when I was developing, I guess, my identity as in my teenage years, I wound up going to the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. in 1972. That really started my education on learning about the 20-point treaty declaration they had. And then when I was 17, I was at Wounded Knee for a time where, they were shooting 50 caliber machine guns in there. And there were several shootouts that I had lived through there. So that's what started me off. I was a high school dropout. That started me off to go back to college and then university. So that's what kicked off my, I guess you could say, my career as a student for a long time in Native Studies programs in the US and Canada, including graduate school. I never finished because I started working for communities in organizations and doing policy analysis. So I've been a policy practitioner for a few decades now at different levels, working with communities, with regional organizations, with the Assembly of First Nations. So that's my background.
Wow, thank you. I can't help but think about the 93 or so termination tables that are out there, and the amount of our people, I guess 300 or so bands are at these tables, negotiating comprehensive lands claims agreements and self-government policies. What can you tell us about that?
Well, basically what's happening now in Canada is a completion of what the Indian Act started in 1876. Canada's, really, you can go back to the Royal Proclamation. Actually, there were peace and friendship treaties in the 1700s, in the Atlantic with the Micmac and the Maliseet and with what was called the Seven Nations Confederacy in what's now Quebec, around Montreal, the French allies of Montreal, the French. And that started in 1760. There were peace and friendship treaties entered into in the spring with the British to remain neutral. The British defeated the French, and in the fall of 1760, there was a Treaty of Kahnawake, bringing the Seven Nations Confederacy along with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as allies of the British. And that led into the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where there was a meeting of thousands of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, nations, basically to negotiate the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, following the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which, you know, basically promised that there would be no trespassing in Indian territory. And the Treaty of 1764 was, you know, to fulfill that promise. And that's why you saw a lot of Indian nations being allies to the British in the War of 1812, when the Americans tried to invade the United States. And it was, you know, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe who were on the front lines, who forced the Americans back. Otherwise, Canada would be part of the United States. And it was only about 1830, 1840 where, you know, the British loyalists were fleeing the United States and coming into Canada and putting pressure on for the military people to get farmland for their families. And so that's when they started to make treaties in Ontario, you know, with the Indian nations in Ontario. And they started coming into Eastern Quebec, but they didn't make treaties, as the Royal Proclamation instructed them to do. So we started to be outnumbered by 1830, 1840 in what's now considered Central Canada. In 1850, that's when they started to pass laws in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, as they called the provinces then, which now are Ontario and Quebec. They passed the first law, you know, over Indians there. And the definition of an Indian was anybody living within the communities then, you know. They didn't have Indian status at that point. It was just, you know, people identified in the communities. So the 1850s when they started to pass laws over us, instead of dealing with us as allies, they started to treat us like subjects. And then, of course, in 1867, that's when Canada's first constitution was adopted by, you know, England. And in that constitution, that's really when we became colonized, because that first constitution divided powers between the federal government and the provincial government. And Section 91 powers are the federal powers, and Section 92 are the provincial powers. So under Section 91(24) is where the federal parliament has exclusive legislative authority to pass laws over Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. Provinces have jurisdiction over, you know, basically natural resources, municipalities, hospitals, schools, all that kind of stuff. And that's why, you know, some of the first court cases Indians had in the 1960s, well, I'm jumping ahead a bit. 1876 is when the Indian Act, they consolidated all that pre-Confederation before 1867 legislation on Indians. They consolidated that into an Indian Act in 1876. And that's the law that's still on the books today in 2022. That's the main statute they use to control and manage status Indians and reserves. Because the Indian Act defines who an Indian is, what a band is, what the bylaw making powers of a band council are. It defines a band council, it defines reserves. All those definitions are under the Indian Act. And that's the basis of the money for federal transfers for programs and services on reserve, is based on the Indian Act. That's statutory authority. And of course, it had kind of two objectives. One was to protect Indians until they could be, under the second objective, assimilated. They become full Canadian citizens or enfranchised. That was the ultimate purpose of the Indian Act, was to train Indians who were considered like children, you know, wards of the government, until they could be fit for citizenship or enfranchised, and no longer Indians within the meaning of the Indian Act, right, which is what it says on your status card. If you look at your status card, it says you're an Indian within the meaning of the Indian Act, which is defined in the Indian Act as a status Indian. And, you know, my wife is from Saskatchewan, Treaty 4, and my in-laws always used to talk about their treaty cards. And I said, what treaty card? And I had them show it to me. I said, that's not a treaty card. That's defining you. It's a status card defining you as an Indian under the Indian Act. Right. Because what they did was they made the treaties, you know, with England, the number treaties, but then they implemented the Indian Act instead of, you know, honoring the spirit and intent of the treaties. And that's the case today, right? For all the treaty nations on the prairies and elsewhere who have historic treaties, they're implementing the Indian Act over them. So what's happening today is successive governments have continued to implement the Indian Act, although they've made amendments to it from time to time. Like, for example, in 1927, Descahe went from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He went and took a steamship to the League of Nations in Geneva to try and get recognition for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. England and Canada intervened to stop him from being able to hit the floor to speak to the delegates at the League of Nations. So he took a steamship back and he made it as far as Niagara Falls on the American side, but the Canadians wouldn't let him in. And he wound up dying of pneumonia by Niagara Falls on the American side in Tuscarora territory. But at the same time, because the Haudenosaunee at Six Nations and elsewhere were demanding recognition of the traditional government, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they amended the Indian Act in 1927 to have an election in Six Nations. And although they only had a few people participate, a few members, the federal government recognized the results of that election, and that's how they forced the longhouse, the traditional longhouses, to the side, and forced the elective system in. They'd also passed in 1888, I think it was, or 1880, the Indian Advancement Act, and that was to try and get the Haudenosaunee communities to start going into the elective system too. So they've been using, the Indian Act and amendments to the Indian Act. In a 1927 amendment, they also made it illegal for Indians to hire lawyers to hold ceremonies. That's when a lot of, the communities, the traditional people did ceremonies underground and had to hold meetings underground because you couldn't hold a meeting without the permission of the Indian agent. Each reserve had an Indian agent that controlled the band councils. Maybe the people would elect a band council in, those that participated in the elections, and not everybody did. But whoever got elected in as a band council that Ottawa recognized, they had to work with the Indian agent. And the Indian agent would draft up the band council resolutions and that to make sure that, the control was there, right? And it was in, from 1927 to 1951, that was the version of the Indian Act that was in place. So you have a whole generation of people that had to go underground because the RCMP were backing up the Indian agent. They also had the passes, right? The Indian passes were mostly they applied the pass law on Saskatchewan and Alberta. Maybe a bit in Manitoba, I'm not sure, but I know for sure in Saskatchewan and Alberta they did. And that's where you couldn't leave the reserve unless you had a pass from the Indian agent. Otherwise, the RCMP could arrest you and put you in jail. And there's actually a movie out, a documentary called The Pass Law or something like that. If you haven't seen it, people should see it. Because they interview people in there who lived through the pass system and had passes. And they have some examples they show in the documentary.
Yeah.
So anyways, it was all about controlling Indians. So at the same time, the Indian Act from 1927 to 51 prohibited hiring lawyers and holding ceremonies and meetings and all that. And that's when a lot of the material culture was stolen too, like wampum belts, medicine masks. Out in the BC, the big houses they have out there, they took their masks because all those ceremonial things were tied to government, right?
Right.
And so they wanted to get rid of traditional government and impose the Indian Act elective system. So the Indian Act was the main law that was used to do that. And also in 1931, I believe it was, they had the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement that they handed over on the prairies. They transferred the rights over the natural resources to the provinces. Remember, the provinces were carved out of what used to be the Northwest Territories. And a lot of the Northwest Territories, going back to the Royal Proclamation, were handed over to the Hudson's Bay Company. Rupert's Land, it was called. And that covered most of the prairies. And that's what they carved Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, the Northwest Territories, the Yukon Territory, all carved out of the Northwest Territories. Over the evolution of territorial evolution of Canada was done through that. But in 1931, they passed this Natural Resources Transfer Agreement when the Indian Act made it illegal for Indians to hire a lawyer, right? So Indians couldn't fight it. They couldn't even hold meetings about it because that was illegal. So they handed over the natural resources, over treaty lands in the prairies to the provinces. And that's why the provinces today say they're not going to share royalties from natural resource development, right? Because they're using the natural resources transfer agreement that Ottawa passed, right? Anyway, in 1951, they amended the Indian Act again and relaxed those laws after World War II. There had been a joint House of Commons Senate committee holding meetings in the late 1940s, that led up to the 1951 amendments, where they, you could say, liberalized the Indian Act a bit more from how restrictive it was. And, that's what led into the 1960s when Pierre Trudeau, in 1968, Pierre Trudeau was elected Prime Minister, and he made Jean Chrétien his Minister of Indian Affairs. And that's when they proposed the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy that had a number of measures in there to basically terminate, the legal distinctions between Indians and Canadians. They proposed doing that by repealing the Indian Act, by amending the British North America Act of 1867 to remove that reference in 9124 over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Because the argument that Pierre Trudeau was making under his just society concept is that it was discrimination that kept Indians in poverty. Special laws, you don't need special laws. You need to get rid of all that and become equal to Canadians. And so they proposed doing that, like I say, by getting rid of the Indian Act, by removing references to Indians in the Constitution, the first Constitution, and getting rid of reserves, getting rid of the Department of Indian Affairs, channeling all programs to the same services of the provinces that Canadian citizens get, ending the treaties, the historic treaties, appointing a treaty commissioner over a land claims commissioner. So they were going to provide economic development funding and that, and they were going to do this all within 5 years. So from 1969, 5 years later, they expected to have all of that done. But the reaction across Canada was, Indians organized, the chiefs of the bands organized to fight that, and they organized with the people. And that's where the modern political organizations were created, was to fight the White Paper. That's when the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood was formed, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the Union of Nova Scotia Indians, the Union of Ontario Indians. And because a lot of these leaders worked in trades, the union model was a model they were familiar with. That's how come when they created these organizations, they were called unions, right? Because it was almost like management and a worker kind of thing, right? Where the government, you're kind of fighting management, the government, right? So that was the model they used to kind of develop the political advocacy organizations with, was kind of the unions. So all the modern organizations across the provinces were created to fight the White Paper. And they created the National Indian Brotherhood to be the umbrella organization of all these provincial organizations. And, that was the organization representing status Indians across Canada. And so it was 100 years after the Indian Act was passed, pretty much 1876. So in 1968, that's when the White Paper was proposed, about 100 years later. They figured Indians were assimilated enough to become Canadians, so they didn't need the Indian Act anymore. And also, Trudeau's concept was, and he basically was kind of projecting his view of the Quebec separatist movement onto Indians. He didn't believe anybody in Canada had collective rights except the state. The Canadian state is the only one with the right. Otherwise, you have individual rights. So he didn't believe in group rights, certainly not for Quebec. And I think he applied that to Indians as well. Because, he made a speech about, you can't have one part of society having a treaty with another part of society, that kind of thing, right? But when Indians organized across Canada to fight the White Paper, it was in 1971, there was a big meeting in Ottawa, and they were presented with the Red Paper. and the brown paper was developed out of Manitoba. So all the regional organizations, the provincial organizations had developed their own response to the white paper of what they wanted instead of the white paper proposal. And of course, it was all based on recognizing Aboriginal treaty rights, not the Indian Act, not amending the Indian Act. That wasn't what they were asking for. They were asking for recognition of Aboriginal treaty rights, which had been ignored, right? The Indian Act had been imposed and they ignored Aboriginal treaty rights instead. So anyways, in 1971, Pierre Trudeau was handed the red paper that Harold Cardinal out of Alberta had developed with the Indians of Alberta Association, and other papers were presented. And they said they'd agree to withdraw the white paper. But I have letters showing that although they publicly withdrew it, internally they said, the government said that the bureaucracy said they could still implement it. But what they would have to do is recognize that they wouldn't talk about it as a whole package, the white paper as a whole package, that they would talk about it in components, and that they would have to extend the time frame beyond 5 years, that it would take longer to do what they wanted, and that they would basically apply it with different regions in different ways and different methods to get the provinces involved in that. So basically, they said they'd take a decentralized approach to implementing the concepts or the objectives of the white paper. And that's what they've been doing for over the last 50 years. And, along comes Trudeau in 1980. I was there. I was going to school at Trent, Native Studies in Peterborough, and I went to Ottawa because I heard there was going to be a big meeting with Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the chiefs. And so I went to Ottawa, and I was at the hotel where they were having the meeting, and I was there when Trudeau told the chiefs, he said, I want you to treat Canada better than Canada's treated you. And then he told them he's going to patriate the Constitution, because remember I said that first Constitution was enacted, of England, the British Parliament, in 1867. He said he wanted to patriate it back to Canada. So that was in 1980. So he announced that he was going to lead a process to do that. And then it became public that he was going to start a process to come up with a new constitution. So that led to negotiations between the provincial premiers, the federal government. And who was his justice minister to do that? Jean Chrétien. So Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs who proposed the white paper, recommendations or proposals. And then as Justice Minister, it was the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan during the negotiation of the draft constitution. There was a clause in there that said, we recognize and affirm the Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples. Just one sentence. And the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, Premier Lougheed and Blakeney out of Saskatchewan, asked Trudeau and Chrétien to take that clause out of the draft constitution, and they did. They removed the clause because there was horse trading going on between the provincial premiers and the territorial leaders and the federal government, and that was one of the things that got tossed was Aboriginal treaty rights reference, and of course First Nations across Canada were angry about that. There was a debate about whether Aboriginal treaty rights should be included in the new constitution or not. First Nations or Indian First Nations were split on that. I think most felt that it should be in there because if it isn't in the new constitution, people were worried they'd be ignored. Some felt it shouldn't be included in there because it should be, part of international law. They had and the treaties in particular, they felt the treaties shouldn't be domesticated by Canada because they weren't entered into with England, right? Not Canada. The Crown and right of England. And so there was a lot of movement to put Aboriginal treaty rights back in this new constitution. And in BC, they organized a train called the Constitution Express that left Vancouver. Everybody that got on the train had to raise their own money to buy a ticket to get on the train to go to Ottawa. And the purpose of going to Ottawa was to put pressure on the federal government to put that clause back in. And a lot of Canadians who were progressive supported that too. They said, yes, Aboriginal treaty rights should be included in this new constitution. So there was a broad public pressure on Pierre Trudeau and Chrétien to put the Aboriginal treaty rights back in there. The train went across Canada, it came into Ottawa, and there were thousands of Indians that converged on Ottawa, pressuring. They went to the Governor Generals and protested. They were holding rallies and teach-ins all over Ottawa. A group of them broke off and went to Europe, and were lobbying European governments about what was going on in Canada, at the United Nations and that as well. Anyways, Pierre Trudeau, with the pressure, said, "Okay, we're going to put it back in." But when Chrétien, Mr. White Paper, put it back in as the Justice Minister, he added a word in there. He added the word "existing" to try and limit future interpretations of that clause in the Constitution. So the clause he put in says, we hereby recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples. And of course, they also had Section 37 in that new Constitution, which said within 1 year of that new Constitution becoming law, there has to be a First Ministers' Conference on Aboriginal matters. So the new Constitution became law when the Queen signed it into law on April 17th, 1982 on Parliament Hill, after it went through, the House of Commons, the House of Lords in England and that. Once it passed through the legislative process in England, and the Queen signed it into law in Canada. And so they had 1 year to hold this First Ministers' Conference. So in March of 1983, there was a First Ministers' Conference on Aboriginal matters, and the leaders of the national Aboriginal organizations were invited. There were 4 at the time. Actually, there were 3, and then there was a court case where the Métis National Council split off from the Native Council of Canada. So it was the Assembly of First Nations, the Inuit Taparizat, Native Council of Canada, and the Métis National Council. So the heads of those organizations were invited, along with the premiers of the provinces and the heads of the Northwest Territories and the Yukon territorial leaders. And of course, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, I think, I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, Chrétien was there as the Minister of Justice, and then they had the Minister of Indian Affairs there. So it was a big, long table, and they had it at the old railroad committee building in Ottawa, across from the Chateau Frontenac, I guess it's called now. Anyway, it was televised. There was a lot of these constitutional talks were televised. And René Lévesque, who never signed the Constitution, gave his seat up to the Native women to raise the issue about the gender discrimination in the Indian Act. So women married 2X early from Kahnawake, and Sharon Lovelace from New Brunswick, who had won a human rights complaint against Canada, they got to speak. And while people were talking in general about, Section 35 rights, because they had to be defined, that was the purpose of the meeting, was to identify and define the meaning of Aboriginal treaty rights in this new Constitution. So they were at that meeting, and while those issues were being debated, there was a technical group on the side of everybody, provinces, the Aboriginal organizations, the federal government, and they came up with a 1983 constitutional amendment. And in that amendment, they added Section 35(3), to Section 35 that said, for greater certainty, any land claims agreement that has been signed or may be signed is a treaty within the meaning of Section 35(1). So they created these new category of treaties called comprehensive land claims agreements as treaties. So the first one that was signed in Canada was the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975. So all these so-called modern treaties, basically had constitutional status once they amended the Constitution to include them in as treaties. And that word land claims, that's a very prejudicial term. And that came from Pierre Trudeau. In 1973, there was a Calder case. The Supreme Court of Canada had a split decision on whether Aboriginal title existed or not. 3 said yes, 3 said no. The 7th judge ruled against the Nisga'a on a technicality. but it scared the federal government. So in 1973, they issued a native claims statement where they said they'd negotiate land claims, comprehensive claims in areas of Canada where there weren't land treaties, you know, like BC, the Atlantic, parts of Ontario, Northwest Territories, the Yukon. And they would negotiate specific claims for lawful obligations, which really applied to the treaty nations, like not creating reserves, right? Treaty land entitlement and also mismanagement of reserve lands and mismanagement of trust funds. Those are all specific claims. But the word land claims came from Trudeau, came from the government. And then they put it in the Constitution in 1983. They called it land claims agreements. So those are a different category of treaties than the treaties signed with England. You know, the number treaties and the other treaties in Ontario and that. So anyway, also included in that 1983 amendment was an agreement to hold 3 more First Ministers conferences, because Constitution only provided for one, which was the 1983 conference, where they made the amendment to they added section 35(4) that said the laws will be guaranteed equally to the men and women, Aboriginal men and women, because of that gender issue that was the gender discrimination of the Indian Act. So they added those 2 sections to section 35. And then they added, said they'll hold 3 more meetings. And then they had kind of a wish list of issues that would be talked about at the further First Ministers conferences. Rights of the Métis, Aboriginal title, treaties, you know, there's a self-government, a whole bunch of issues. And so the focus of identifying and defining the meaning of Aboriginal treaty rights kind of got sidelined at that meeting in 1983 with that big long list of issues. Anyways, the main issue in 1984 and 85 and the last conference in 1987 was self-government. Is it an inherent right, or is it a conditional right, depending on reaching agreements with the Crown governments, you know, with the federal and provincial governments? And the 4 national Aboriginal organizations said, no, it's already an existing right, Aboriginal right under Section 35. You just need to recognize it, then we'll negotiate. And the premiers and the prime minister said, no, you know, you have to negotiate, you have to agree to a process with us. And they kept setting out a proposed process to lead to negotiating agreements. And the 4 national organizations kept rejecting that, because they didn't want to get sucked into the idea of having to negotiate agreements. They wanted the government to recognize that the inherent right to self-government was an existing Aboriginal right up front. But they wouldn't do that. That's how come there was one movie that's going around called Dancing Around the Table. And that's what they were dancing around, was the issue of self-government. So the last constitutionally required First Ministers Conference was in 1987. Moroni was the chair, and nobody knew it, but he was having secret talks with the Premier of Quebec, Robert Bourassa, on recognizing Quebec as a distinct society. So that's when they didn't know that at the time when the last First Ministers Conference was being held. So it ended in failure. They failed to define the Aboriginal treaty rights in Section 35 through those. There was supposed to be a political agreement, right, between the Aboriginal organizations and, you know, the premiers and the prime minister on. It was supposed to be a political agreement. They didn't reach any political agreement. So in 1990, the Supreme Court of Canada took over, starting with the Sparrow case, defining what Section 35 rights are. They said they're not absolute, they can be justifiably infringed. And for the last 30-some years, the Supreme Court of Canada has been defining Section 35 rights, Aboriginal treaty rights, by issuing different legal principles and different legal tests, which cost millions of dollars to collect the cultural and historical evidence, you know, to meet the test. And even then, there's no guarantee you're going to meet it. And that's what the government's used to drive their policy to negotiate. And so, you know, it's really Section 35 that's defining Section 35. Federal governments use policy to define it at negotiating tables, and they put money at those tables, and that's how they've basically sucked in the band councils to negotiate self-government or, you know, these so-called modern treaties. But they've also developed a whole suite of policies but the self-government policy is the umbrella policy. And in 19, I was a liberal at one point. I helped create the Aboriginal Liberal Commission in 1990. There was a Liberal convention that created the commission where they amended the Liberal Party of Canada's constitution, creating an Aboriginal People's Commission. They already had a Women's Commission and a Youth Commission, so they added this Aboriginal People's Commission in 1990. I was elected as the founding executive committee as the vice president of policy. So from 1990 to 1994, I was involved in the Liberal Party dealing with Aboriginal policy. And so in 1993, there was a federal election. And so I was involved with others from the commission developing the Aboriginal platform of the Liberal Party. And so I was involved in helping get Chrétien, who was the leader of the party, to agree to include in the platform that a Liberal government would act on the premise that the inherent right to self-government was an existing right under Section 35 of the Constitution. They promised that in the Red Book. And they also issued a longer platform in October of 93 that Chrétien released with that elaborating on that promise. But when he formed a majority government in 1993, in 1995, without consultation, he imposed the 1995 inherent right policy, to self-government. And it's an anything but inherent right policy because it has all these preconditions to negotiations. It also says, they won't recognize any right to self-determination in any international sense. Basically, what the self-government policy does is it converts Indian Act bands into municipal type governments, local governments. And what they were trying to get at the constitutional table and didn't get, they got by offering money to people who want to negotiate to get out of the Indian Act and go into self-government, that they would fund the negotiations. So hundreds of bands, signed up to get the money because that's money on top of your program and service dollars to talk about self-government. And, hundreds of bands, have been doing that since the 1980s, 90s, the 1990s. But they haven't reached final agreements, not that many have. They also agreed to include self-government as part of the land claims negotiations. So you have a few dozen groups that have signed, comprehensive claims and self-government agreements. They're using those agreements as templates now. And now the government is saying Section 35 is a full box. Remember, they said it was an empty box, but that was the metaphor they used in the constitutional talks: full box, empty box. The Aboriginal organization said that Section 35 is a full box of rights. The government says, no, it's an empty box. You have to negotiate an agreement with us to fill it up. And the talks ended in failure, the constitutional talks, but in the 1990s, through the policy discussions, they started to get some agreements. So now, in 2015, that's when Justin Trudeau's Liberals were elected in, and he had Carolyn Bennett be the first Minister of Indigenous Affairs in 2015, and she started saying, we're going to endorse the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Section 35 is a full box. Of course, the government's saying it's a full box now because the Supreme Court of I say it's emptied it out, but they're saying it's filled it up with these legal principles and legal tests you have to meet, right, for Aboriginal, to prove you have Aboriginal treaty rights. While on the government's negotiation policies for self-government and land claims, they're using those court decisions, to go and basically reduce the expectations of what you're going to get at in those negotiations in final agreements. And so that's what they're using now. Justin Trudeau, Pierre's son, became prime minister, and for the past 6 years, what they've done is they put in place a national reconciliation policy or plan. And one of the things Trudeau did when he was elected in the fall of 2015, in January of 2016, he named Michael Warnick, the clerk of the Privy Council. That's the top bureaucrat job in Ottawa. The clerk of the Privy Council's job is to work with the Prime Minister and the federal cabinet on the government's plans, you know. So it was the bureaucracy, it was Warnick's job to take the 2015 election platform of Justin Trudeau and turn it into a plan that would fit with federal objectives. And that's what they did. Warnick was Stephen Harper's Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs for 8 years. And, you know, he was the one that led the spying on Cindy Blackstock and, you know, did the spying on communities in this hotspot campaign. He did a bunch of bad things for Harper anyway. And now he became Trudeau's main guy. And as soon as Trudeau named him, I knew, you know, in 2016, I said, Trudeau's talking rhetoric. He's just going to keep doing what Harper was doing. And that's what he's done. They said one thing and they've done another, right? So Warnick, it was Warnick that got the plan in place. And part of the plan was to take a top-down secretive approach using the national Indigenous organizations. So the Assembly of First Nations for the Status Indians, the Métis National Council for the Métis, the Inuit Taparizzat for the Inuit. He used those three organizations and the leaders of those organizations to participate in what he calls bilateral mechanisms. You know, in 2016, the national chief of AFN, Perry Bellegarde, signed a memorandum of understanding with Carolyn Bennett to create a new fiscal relationship. Of course, the money is what drives everything, right? So they put that in place to change how funding bans would work. And in 2017, Trudeau signed an agreement with National Chief Bellegarde on joint priorities. And that's why I say they basically took over AFN then and the other organizations through this bilateral mechanism, because what that agreement on joint priorities did was it set up basically a subcommittee to cabinet, you know, where there would be what Trudeau is calling co-development of policy and law. But really it's the federal government that controls the pen, the process, and the agenda, because they fund all of that. And under Perry Bellegarde's reign as, you know, national chief, he went along with the Trudeau government on everything and endorsed it. And there was no critical analysis. You know, in 2017, Jody Wilson-Raybould issued these 10 principles for Indigenous relationship, which are very prejudicial to Aboriginal treaty rights. But it was worded in such a way it was hard to unpack it. And AFN didn't do an analysis of that. And they used that as those 10 principles as a way to start negotiating the changes to policy and laws that they were doing. And they were using these bilateral mechanisms, these three national organizations, to basically rubber stamp cabinet decisions on Aboriginal or Indigenous policy. And so that's what's been going on for the last 6 years, including the development of legislation, the Indigenous Languages Act, the Indigenous Child and Family Services Act. That's all based on the self-government policy principles, you know, where it's delegated authority. And even if you didn't agree with the Indigenous Child and Family Services Act, as soon as you participate into the legislation, the processes, you're accepting the legislation, which is what's happening now, right? Out of necessity, a lot of First Nations are, you know, getting involved in setting up these child and family service agencies because they need the money. If they want to take it over, they have to accept the rules, right? So that's what's happening. And in 2019, to cap it all off, what Trudeau did was he had an 800-page omnibus bill, a budget bill, and buried in that legislation was the legislation to dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs. Remember, the white paper said that that was part of the plan, was to dissolve Indian Affairs. And they replaced it with 2 Indigenous departments under what Trudeau calls a 2-track approach. So Indigenous Services Canada, their job is to look after their constitutional obligations for Indians and lands reserved for Indians and the Indian Act on reserve. So that's what Patty Hedges' job is to look after, you know, the services on reserve. Until bands sign on to self-government, which is where Mark Miller's job comes in. Crown Indigenous Relations Department its job is to implement the self-government and modern treaty agreements that all the bands are expected to sign on to, because they're being managed eventually to all of them to move out of the Indian Act into these new Section 35 agreements. And, along with the dozens of bands that already have signed agreements like that already. And the federal government has said that Indigenous Services Canada will dissolve once they transfer program and service deliveries to these Indigenous governing bodies. And that's the other thing. In that 2019 legislation, they define an Indigenous governing body as either a band council, an Indigenous government, and in order to be an Indigenous government, you have to sign a self-government agreement or a modern treaty to be federally recognized, or a body with a Section 35 mandate. So in other words, a body like a Child and Family Services Agency that's been mandated by bands or by an Indigenous government, to manage child and family services. So that's what the Indigenous governing bodies is. It's a transitional term to move Indian bands from Indigenous Services Canada into Crown relations. And so that's in place. So that's what they're doing now, is they're processing band by band through negotiations and plans, removing them from the Indian Act. They have to consent to it, but that's where the money is going to come in, that if they want more money, they're going to have to go along with the government's plan to move to self-government. And the government has a new, so there's two fiscal policies now. There's the 10-year grants for the Indian Act bands, where you'll get a 10-year block of funds. No new money, it's at the same levels, but you'll get it for 10 years. And for the bands who signed self-government, there's a self-government fiscal policy, which is available online, right? You can go and look up collaborative self-government fiscal policy and you'll find it online. And that policy is a funding formula, and it's based on own source revenue, which is code for taxation. Because Section 87 of the Indian Act is where it says property on reserve cannot be taxed. Feds want to get rid of that section, and they've already done it. Some bands have committed to, applying taxation systems on reserve. But Section 87 is the section that says property on reserve can't be taxed. And the courts have interpreted income earners on reserve as property on reserve. So that's where you get the tax exemption from, where you don't pay personal income tax or sales tax or anything on reserve. But when you go into self-government, that's all gone. You're paying taxes, income tax, sales tax, property tax, the whole bit. And that's the government's objective, is to move everybody into full self-government status, as the Prime Minister says, Prime Minister Trudeau. And that's where we're at, is now they're moving all the bands eventually to that destination of signing self-government agreements to be implemented under Crown Indigenous Relations Department. And they'll dissolve the Department of Indigenous Services once they've gotten all the bands to take over program and service delivery through these self-government agreements. So that's the National Reconciliation Plan. And a friend of mine, Dr. Jeremy Schmidt, just wrote a paper called Dispossession Through Municipalization. And he's basically, from the academic side, he's documenting how the rights recognition framework of Trudeau, that's what it's doing. He's describing it academically. And I'm just kind of laying out to you from the policy practitioner's point of view how it works. Think of it as an assembly line, where you put a box on the assembly line, and that's Indigenous Services Canada, and you're being moved over to Crown Indigenous Relations, where they'll finish packing what's going inside the box. So that's the big picture of the Trudeau plan. And it's really, it's like I say, it's a climax of what the Indian Act started and what, the white paper proposed, and what successive governments have done, liberal and conservative, And when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister, after being Minister of Indian Affairs and Justice Minister, limiting the meaning of Section 35, as Prime Minister, he passed the First Nations Land Management Act, to move bands out of the Indian Act into these land codes, which is a step towards fee simple or private property. And he also it was his government that passed the First Nations Fiscal Management Act, which they now call the First Nations Fiscal Institutions Act, to set up taxation on reserve. So, and they created these national institutions, the First Nations Finance Authority, the First Nations Fiscal Management Board. The Finance Authority is a revolving loan fund, to pay for roads and bridges and things and to issue bonds. First Nations Financial Management Board is the board to help manage all of that. And they have the First Nations Tax Commission. And under the First Nations Tax Commission, under Harper, they were working on an initiative called the First Nations Property Ownership Initiative. Manny Jules heads up that commission, working with Stephen Harper. And the idea was to privatize residential lands on reserve under this First Nations Property Ownership Initiative. Well, when the Trudeau government came in 2015, in 2016, they renamed it the Indigenous Land Title Initiative. Sounds nicer, right? But it's still about privatizing residential lands on reserve into fee simple. And so that's where, after the land codes are developed, it's kind of a transitional step to, titling the lands of the land code after you register all this interest in the land code, to move towards registering your lands under this Indigenous Land Title Initiative. Eventually, they want to move lands under Section 92. Remember, I said the first Constitution, Section 91, is federal powers, Section 92 were provincial powers. Well, groups that sign modern treaties like the Nishka, their lands start getting registered under the provincial land registry system because they have fee simple. They don't have reserve lands anymore. And so that's the objective, is to get rid of reserve lands, turn them into individual land holdings, fee simple, and eventually get them under provincial jurisdiction, which is what the white paper proposed over 50 years ago. But they're doing it, they're couching it under nice sounding words like reconciliation and nation to nation. Indigenous Land Title Initiative, it all sounds nice, but when you drill down and look at the real terms and conditions and nuts and bolts of it, it's to create this fourth level of ethnic Indigenous governments. And that's what Trudeau said in 2016. He said Indigenous governments are the fourth level of government in Canada. So this is something that he's been working on, his government, since they got in 2015. We're now 6 years into the plan. He's being pretty successful because he's building on what has gone on before him. And he's invested almost $30 billion in new money over the last 3 budgets. So that's how come many of the band councils aren't saying anything, because they're getting additional money for program and service delivery. So basically, they've been quiet about all of this. And all these tables you referred to at the beginning, these recognition and self-determination tables, and the self-government tables, and the comprehensive claims tables, those are all negotiated in secret. Their community members don't know what's going on there. The band councils negotiate in secret. They don't tell their community members what's happening until they're ready to bring out an agreement to be ratified, like an agreement in principle or final agreement. Then they have to get ratified in communities. And the yes side is always well funded with lawyers and communication strategies and everything. The no side never gets money because the government wants a yes vote, not a no vote. So the yes side, the campaigns are always to sell the agreement, right? And that's been the pattern for these self-government and land claims agreements, is the yes side wins because the no side isn't organized. They don't have lawyers to say, well, here's the downside. So that's the system that we're all facing now. And they're doing it band by band. And also that's in the rules too. One band can't talk to another band about what's happening at your negotiating table, right? You have to sign non-disclosure agreements saying you can't reveal what you're talking about at your table. Meanwhile, the federal negotiators get to talk to the other federal negotiators to get the broader picture of what's happening in all the provinces or the regions, right? On their side, they get to talk to each other to fulfill their national strategy. But on our side, we don't get to do that. Then the money is all what they're using as leverage, right? If you want the negotiation dollars, you have to accept the terms and conditions, or the preconditions is really what they are to negotiations. So I don't know if I have explained enough of it for you, John.
No, I mean, this is fantastic. So
Was I understandable?
very, very much, but I've been listening to you for a long time, and I appreciate the chronology and structure that you put to all the colonial mechanisms that are in place. Like on a practical level, my community is Pimicikamak territory, and I know that of course, Thomas Monius and Rita Monius, they send their blessings. I know that you know Thomas for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And our communities are very, very impoverished. There are high rates of suicide. It was like in 2016, 6 of our children died in a period of, I think it was like 8 weeks or something or less. Just recently, 4 more people died in our community, like a couple of days ago. The Provincial Crown Corporation, Manitoba Hydro, has like serious, it's created a lot of havoc, on the KGCP, the big river, the big Nelson River, and there's methyl mercury in our waters. And there, when we talk about an imposed system of impoverishment, I see it manifested very clearly in our community. There's high levels of alcoholism. I don't think you can find anybody who isn't a diabetic. The food prices are astronomical. I mean, 3-4 times what you would expect. And, so our communities are really grieving. I had hoped to get up there soon, just like last week, but my journey was cut short because, COVID is wreaking havoc with our communities. How does this apply on a grassroots level? What can our people do? We do, there's the Cross Lake Band of Indians, but there's the Pimicikamak people, and a lot of our own people don't understand the difference between the two. They don't.
Well, what I've been telling, I do still advise some band councils. And what I've been saying is you have to develop a self-determination plan. If you want to develop an alternative to Ottawa's plan, you have to work on it. And that means you have to have a research agenda to do the historical and cultural research. Because the courts have placed the burden of proof on us, whether we like it or not. And even if we don't plan on litigating, if we go and do something, we'll get dragged into court, right? Injunctions, the police. So you have to do the research to pull together the history of how you've been treated by the government. And it costs money to do that. So you need to find ways to get maybe university students and others to help you, or foundations or whatever. And you have to do mapping. You have to have computer mapping capability, GIS, Geographic Information System, because all of the plans that the governments and corporations use now are all computerized. Even for forest management, it's computer modeling, and they're using spatial analysis of where the tree stands are, estimating how they're going to go back in 25 years or whatever. They have the species identified. They have what they call polygons, or areas on the map, right? And point data. And current use and occupancy mapping, that's really important too, because that shows you what areas are important to your community for using for harvesting in the bush, right? The bush economy, where you hunt moose. And you have to have protocols to control all that data, because people are very sensitive about where their trap lines, if they're not public trap lines, where they are, where they hunt, where they fish. But you need to collect all that information. And a guy named Terry Tobias wrote a book called Living Proof, and he lays out the methodology and how to do map biographies, where all the adult members, male and female, you can do a map for each of them, identifying all the areas where they hunt, fish, trap, and harvest. And the other half of the questions are on cultural sites, battle sites, cabin sites, all that stuff. It's important to map the land use up, because you need to know that information in a way that you can use to do a plan, a territorial plan, to take on the provincial government and corporations operating in your territory. And also you need to map out, who the third parties are in your territory. So the GIS mapping capability is important. I'd say it's an important modern tool that we have, because you have GPS where you can go out to a cabin site in the bush, and you can go to the four corners of the cabin and send a dot up to a satellite, and you can go back to your office and you can pinpoint within meters of where that cabin is in the bush, and you're pretty accurate at identifying it in your territory. So you get all that information into a computer and do layers, a layer of forest information, kill sites, everywhere that you killed a moose, have a dot showing that from each individual that does a map. You aggregate all those maps on top of each other, and that gives you the land use patterns. And so that's where you can see where they're planning on clear cutting an area, which families affected. You're more precise in being able to respond to outside threats, right, of resource extraction. But you need to have the third party information too. Who's operating in your territory? Who did the province give a forest license to? What companies? You need to have all that information. You can't just have the traditional knowledge. You have to have contemporary information about what's happening on your lands. And out of that, you need to take that in. You need to be good at information management, something our people haven't been very good at. We're not very good at libraries and archives and keeping papers. But the reality is, we have to get good at it. The younger people have to get those skills and help work with the elders to bring that back in so that we can make our own self-determination plans. Because once you start exercising your rights off reserve, I'm sure you've seen this, you're up against outside interests, the province, or if it's a corporation. I remember seeing not too long ago, I don't think it was Cross Lake, I think it was further north. People were against workers doing a shift change up in northern Manitoba for Manitoba Hydro because of COVID. So they put up a blockade trying to block the workers from coming in, and the company, of course, got an injunction, and the police got involved. And I think the people went back at one point after they got some concessions out of the government out of the company, that they weren't going to bring the workers in. So that's what diffused the situation. But my point is, you're always going to wind up having a conflict where they're going to use injunctions and police. So you have to have evidence to back up your rights to be out there and protecting your lands. It costs money. Ottawa's sending a lot of money to band councils now, which I think they're wasting, because all they're doing is going along with Ottawa's agenda. They're giving them money to do comprehensive community planning. They're giving them money to do aggregation of communities, into a larger setting, which is really about, economies of scale to deal with more communities delivering programs and services. Instead of having to spend money on each education unit in each band, they want you to do an umbrella system. Like with child welfare, right? They don't want to fund, 615 child welfare agencies. They want to fund, a few that's going to handle a number of bands, right? Kids from the different bands. So Ottawa's implementing their plan. And with AFN being co-opted, and our provincial organizations being co-opted, and often the band councils being co-opted, grassroots peoples don't have much options to develop these alternative plans, but they need to look for ways to get outside support to do that. Even the UN declaration, and we have to remember that the declaration that was adopted by the United Nations in 2007 is a watered down version from the actual 1994 version, which Indigenous people supported. But nonetheless, that 2007 version, that book lays it out. But the reality is the 2007 version is what we're up against, because now they passed Bill C-15 through Parliament saying they're going to work on aligning their laws with the UN declaration, meaning the 2007 version. And even the 2007 version has Article 18, which says Indigenous peoples have a right to decision-making through their own Indigenous procedures and systems. And AFN and the governments have been ignoring that. They've been focusing on Principle 19, which says you can't change administrative and legislative, make administrative and legislative changes without talking to Indigenous representatives. So that's where they're using AFN, the provincial organizations, the band councils. But principle 18 is where the people come in and the people's voices in decision making, which the Indian Act excluded, right? Once the Indian Act was imposed, our traditional systems of decision making were pushed aside. And that's what we need to start doing, is bringing back the protocols and how we meet outside of the Indian Act band office system to make decisions and then tell those band councils what the people are deciding. But that's going to lead to friction, right? You know, decolonization is a struggle. It's not, nowhere in the world is that easy. And the trend I see now is everybody's going along with, most people don't know what's happening because of this top-down secretive negotiation approach the Trudeau government's applying with band councils. So grassroots people, community members don't know what's happening. And that's one of the first things you need to start demanding from the band council is, okay, what are you negotiating? Show us. Because, you know, you're claiming to do this for us. Let us see it. So there needs to be more meetings with having more transparency, disclosure. It really comes back to information management. But you need people with the skills to manage this information, keep the paper trails, help build a plan. And it's something that we haven't been used to doing. But we need to get used to doing it because that's the system we're facing today. And they're way ahead of us. They're implementing their national plan and they're doing it band by band. And unless we come up with our own alternatives on the ground, from on the ground up, the top down processes are going to, and for the people that say, oh, it doesn't matter, we have our traditional laws and that, well, you're going to end up getting dragged into the court system, you know, with the police and that, and they're going to rely on that, those agreements that are signed, which include you as members. Because their courts are already saying, like the Bain decision, you know, it was a family group. The Supreme Court of Canada said that they didn't have a mandate from the community. So they were blocking logging. They're saying the band council was consulted. Doesn't matter if they're logging your family area. You know, you didn't have the mandate to represent the whole community. They did. And so they were tossed out. Their case was tossed out based on the Bain decision. But that's the Supreme Court of Canada decision. So that's saying that family groups can't override a community. So you're going to have to address the broader community decision-making process and not just talk about some family groups going off to the side trying to do their own thing. Because under the Canadian legal system with these court cases, you know, with injunctions of police, they're going to bring it back on you. And a good example of that is what's going on between the hereditary system and the elective system with the Wet'suwet'en Nation. You know, even though they went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and although they didn't get the court to define their Aboriginal title of territory, the court recognized, the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997 recognized that the Wet'suwet'en plan-based governance system is the legal system for the traditional lands, not the Indian Act band councils. But because they're opposing the pipeline, you know, the government is basically bringing the police in, using injunctions and police to say, no, you know, we have assumed crown sovereignty is basically what they're imposing. And that's the position they're taking. Because even in the Chilcotin case in 2014, the Supreme Court of Canada said the Radicor underlying title belongs to the crown. So that's what they're relying on, is the Chilcotin case. You know, they're saying ultimately it's state sovereignty, right? So First Nation sovereignty is subsumed. And that's why under the self-government agreements, it's basically this fourth level local ethnic government that they're imposing. And communities, some communities are accepting that. But they've always divided us, right? Divide and rule, they're good at that, and that's what they're doing now, using the money. But the first thing is you need to be aware of how it works. And the second thing is to develop a strategy on how you find your own plan to get out of it, you know, from the ground up. And it won't be easy. It's easier to go along with Ottawa rather than to fight Ottawa. And that's why you got most of the band councils in Canada going along with Ottawa. Because they're all funded, right? They all have jobs. Everybody in the band office has jobs, especially with the additional 30 billion that Trudeau's pumping into the band office, band council system. They're not worried about employment, right? It's the community members that are, you know, being left on the side, having to, in the poverty that you describe. And the conditions you're describing at Cross Lake, I know those conditions exist in hundreds of bands across Canada. You know, that suicide's an epidemic everywhere. And Art Manuel described it, right? He said Canadian colonialism is in three phases: dispossession, followed by dependency, and when you try and fight the dependency, comes the third phase, which is oppression, which is the injunctions in the police. So that's the Canadian colonialism is still happening. And all Trudeau's trying to do is say, okay, we're going to give you a lateral move. You're going to be able to move from the Indian Act to this fourth level government. But it's like an old antiquated jail cell that you're in. They're saying, well, you can move out of that to this new jail cell with chrome toilets and a kitchen and everything, but it's still a jail cell. The self-government agreement still describes what your delegated authority is over subject areas and over farmer reserve lands, because they want those lands to become, you know, private property or fee simple. And they're getting it one way or the other, right? They're getting it through the modern treaties. Those groups are agreeing to that in BC. They pretty much got all the Dene and the Northwest Territories to agree. The Inuit have agreed. They've got 4 regions of Inuit territory. And starting with the James Bay Agreement, they agreed to extinguish their Aboriginal title through the comprehensive claims process. So when they appointed Mary Simon as Governor General, I wasn't surprised, because she's gone along with all of this, you know, from the James Bay Agreement on with Pierre Trudeau. She doesn't have any problem being an Indigenous Canadian. So for Justin Trudeau to put it in there, it was a good move, because now they keep referring to an Indigenous Governor General, but it's part of their pan-Indigenous approach of lumping First Nations, Métis, and Inuit together under Indigenous peoples. So they've been pretty good with their special words and tactics, SWAT. They've been pretty good at implementing that, because it convinces a lot of us that Trudeau is a nice guy and he just wants to help us. The Canadian public thinks that. What are you complaining about him for? He gave you $30 billion and he wants to give you self-government, and, you know, he's settling your land claims. He's respecting your treaties, you know, but they don't drill down and look at the details and what's really happening in that transaction. What are you giving up and what are you getting, right? Because what it is it's a negotiation. It's their federal recognition is basically a replacement. You have to surrender your existing rights and replace them with new rights. And that's what these Section 35 self-government agreements, and that's how they're implementing historic treaties, is through that self-government policy. That's what their policy says, is that's how they'll implement the historic treaties, the number of treaties, through self-government agreements to implement the treaty, right? So these discussion tables are setting up across the prairies, because they are on the prairies now. That's where it's supposed to lead. Whether they get to final agreements or not, I don't know. But they're certainly trying to manage getting to final agreements so that it can dissolve the Indian bands, Indigenous Services Canada, so that we're all under Crown Indigenous relations, a new relationship. That's what they call it. But under the new relationship, they'll end their ongoing treaty and fiduciary obligations, because we'll agree to a new fiscal relationship and a new legal relationship and political relationship that they've defined, where they're not committing to funding all of our needs. They're not doing that now, but, you know, there's legal issues that can be raised about them mismanaging reserve lands and monies in that. In fact, they just settled a multi-billion-dollar claim for the water, the mismanagement of the water systems on reserve. So that's an example of, you know, those under the Indian Act brought that case forward. But once you sign these new agreements, you won't have that leverage to say you're not honoring your fiduciary obligations or your treaty obligations to us for programs and services, managing reserves and that. Because you'll be in a new relationship where you have to come up with own source revenue to raise that money yourself. Not totally, right? They're going to reduce the level of transfers and you have to make up the difference. That's why they say you all share in the delivery of programs and services, all levels of government, including Indigenous governments. That's how they describe it.
Wow.
That's how the system works, man.
Yeah, thank you so much, Russ. There's so much that we could continue with this conversation, and I still have a lot of questions. Um, I was at Standing Rock, although I didn't have the honor of meeting Art at that time, Art Manuel, but his work has certainly influenced me in a big way. Um,
Yeah, he
I,
was my best friend.
that's what I came to find out.
Yeah, I miss that guy.
Wow.
But we
I
can do this again, sometime.
Yeah, yeah, we'll definitely do it again. I did get to meet Kahnawake Manuel during my short stint over in Blue River, BC.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and I was honored to share space with them and sort of
she's fierce.
empower their efforts. Yes, absolutely. Um, Thank you. And for those who are watching, this is Russ Diabo, and you you are a Mohawk political analyst and strategist, and you look at where things aren't being implemented as well as the actual policies, and you're helping grassroots people all across Turtle Island, and I would say the world, to get in touch with what it is they need to do in their own particular territories, to break away from the subjugation and impoverishment imposed by governments. One thing I was going to ask you real quick is the parallels, because I'm in Rhode Island, the parallels that are going on either side of the border, Canada and the United States. Where's where can people where's the overlap, and maybe where can people say unite their efforts throughout Turtle Island as a whole?
Well, there are kind of some parallels, but when the United States had the American Revolution, they cut their ties with Britain. Canada didn't, right? Canada relied on Britain to develop their Indian policy, and that's where the Indian Act came from. But in the United States, they kind of had to develop Indian policy as they went along from the 13 colonies on, right? Because that's where they came up with the Indian Removal Act, right, in the 1830s to remove all Indians west of the Mississippi. They made Oklahoma Indian Territory. But to a certain extent, they've recognized that tribes have internal sovereignty in the states, not external, right? Because they're saying Congress has plenary power over the tribes, like in other words, sovereignty over the tribes. And in 1934, I think it was, they had the Indian Reorganization Act by John Collier. And I guess, there's been a big debate about that, but his policy was to have tribes develop constitutions, mirroring the American system of having three branches of government: a legislative, a judicial, and an executive branch. So some tribes developed constitutions, some didn't. I lived on the Navajo Nation. They were one of the ones who developed that system. So they have the three branches of government. They're the largest tribe in the United States. The Navajos, they're in 4 states. Their reservation is like 26,000 square miles. So in that sense, the United States recognizes self-government more than Canada does, but they're still dependent on Washington, D.C. for transfer payments to deliver programs and services on reserve. They also pay taxes on reserve. So, there's a lot of things down on the American side that are happening that, because it's been a different evolution of Indian policy down there,
Right.
than it has with Canada, which followed the British model. Because the British model was to assimilate Indians in the long term, intergenerationally. The residential schools, the reserve system, it was all to generally assimilate Indians until, like I said, they were fit for Canadian citizenship or enfranchisement. And that's where a lot of people lost their status, right? Because they're saying, well, you don't need to be an Indian anymore, you can be a Canadian. And that's where Bill C-31 in 1985 reinstated people who lost their status for different reasons. But down in the States, they have blood quantum, right? They don't have the status. So the tribal roles have blood quantum. So there's some similarities, but a lot of differences. Also, they had the cavalry down there, which was a lot more brutal, right? A lot more open massacres. Whereas up here, they killed us, through administration more than soldiers. Mind you, after Louis Riel, and they hung some of the chiefs, and they brought the the Northwest Mounted Police in, which is basically an army. So they did apply that in the prairies to a certain extent, but for the most part, once they moved Indians to reserves, they just forced them into poverty and kept them there, forced underdevelopment.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, the American side has done that too with the reservations, right? Especially the reservations that don't have resources, right? Look at Pine Ridge, where Wounded Knee was. They're one of the poorest. They like to say the poorest counties in the United States, but that's a reservation.
Yeah.
And that's because they've been forced into the situation that they're in. So there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. And even self-determination, right? To a certain extent, they have a little bit more recognition down there than we do on the Canadian side, because the government here doesn't recognize we have any internal sovereignty. It's only we have the Indian Act, and if we want out of the Indian Act, they're controlling the ways out of the Indian Act, which is either self-government, that's the main one, or where you don't have land treaties, these modern treaties. Or if you want out of the Indian Act, you can go into the Land Management Act, other federal laws that they've created.
Right.
But they're controlling all those pathways out of the Indian Act into basically being assimilated into municipal type bodies. In the United States, they're kind of maintaining the tribal system for now. But the termination policy, they brought that in the 1950s where they terminated tribal status. And I was the one that coined the term termination because I studied with Vine Deloria Jr. in Tucson at the University of Arizona in graduate studies. When Tom Flanagan was issuing his book in that, because he's an American that moved to Canada, I deliberately introduced that term termination policy into Canada, and I started calling them termination tables and termination chiefs. Because although it's a bit different than the United States, there's parallels there in terms of terminating status too. So in that sense, both the U.S. and Canada, that's their long-term objectives. And when Trump was president, they were worried about him bringing back the termination policy, and he was thinking about it. And you never know what's going to happen in 2024, right? If he gets in as president, maybe he'll continue with that. So that's why I think, we need to focus on our internal development and not hoping a political party or an outside body is going to save us. We have to save ourselves. That's what self-determination means. And that's why I say in Canada, we need to do the research, mapping, and planning process, each community from the ground up until we can do it at the nation level, right? And there's a lot of Cree communities, but the Indian Act system, the band system is for each band to look after itself, right? Kind of a self-interest, right? That's the way the system is designed. Because you get the money from Ottawa, your band budget, you have a 2-year election. So everything's about self-interest for your band, and it doesn't lend itself to supporting the development of nationhood, working with other communities. The tribal councils were kind of an attempt, but even that's controlled by Ottawa, right? And that's mostly for program and service delivery. Anyway, things happening in the U.S. There are brothers and sisters, and we definitely have ties. The Mohawk Nation's on both sides. Bloods are on both sides.
Right.
The Anishinaabe are on both sides. The Mi'kmaq, we got a lot of nations there, that border cut right through us, right? So we definitely have kinship there. But we're dealing with two different state governments and systems, two different histories of colonialism. They're parallel, but different.
Right, and I have a wonderful time talking with Linda Coombs, who is a Kahnawake, as are my children. But she is a Wampanoag tribal historian for all the tribes over there, Quina, Mashpee, and even Herring Pond. And then of course, so I get two perspectives, from Canada and United States Indigenous colonial history. It's fascinating and it's overwhelming in many ways, and but there's a lot of parallels. And so I'm hoping maybe we could turn this into like an educational series, for people, because obviously we've been on here for a while, and there's a lot of things we could talk about. But I'll tell people, here's a book that Russ recommended to me, the Reconciliation Manifesto by Arthur Manuel and Grand Chief Ronald Derrickson, whose link you sent me. You told me a little bit about the story of Chief D, right? And that's an interesting, it's an interesting economic development that occurred, for a remote community. And yeah, it's a fascinating story.
Well, it's not remote. It's next to Kelowna.
Oh, okay.
See, that's the thing is Canada has used 4 bands in BC for their economic ideas, and they're all next to cities. So they don't really, the model doesn't really work for rural or isolated communities. But they use Musqueam Band, Squamish Band in North Vancouver, Kamloops next to the city of Kamloops, and West Bank next to the city of Kelowna.
Yeah.
So they had kind of an advantage where their reserves were, you could kind of treat them as real estate, And that's what he pointed out is, they went and leased lands in 99-year leases for residential purposes because they had extra land they didn't use.
Yeah.
And they're using that money as revenue for the band, right? So
Right.
some bands in BC are doing that long-term leasing for housing. Musqueam does that, others. There's a lot of bands that don't have enough land to even think about that long. They have to think of other things, right?
Yeah. How do you do it on 0.2% of your land base? How do you even establish?
Exactly. Well, he did it because he was next to the city. If you go there now, you'll see there's big shopping stores there. He put the infrastructure in, like when he was chief, he put in the heavy duty electricity grid and everything down under the road so that then shopping malls and everything could hook up. So there's a 4-lane highway going through his reserve, from Kelowna, and they have these big box stores and they had the trailer parks. They're building a hotel. They got resorts. So if you go there and you're a status Indian, you can use your status card and not pay tax. Even for Starbucks, they got a Starbucks there. They'll take the tax off if you show your status card at Starbucks because it's all on reserve. Right. But he was the architect of a lot of that. He's no longer the chief there, but that's his story. Is he became a multi-millionaire doing his own thing, and he had lands on the reserve that he developed, but he also got the band to develop and brought the band's average median income up too. And he's got enemies, but he was friends with Art Manuel, and I became friends with him, and he supports Indigenous rights, even though he's a multi-millionaire, and he doesn't like a lot of what the government does. He fought with the government even as Indian Act chief. So he's got a book out too. Here it is here. Fight or submit. So that's him. So this is his life story, and he's got a very interesting story. This book is pretty interesting. It's worth reading too, because his story, and him and Art were kind of strange, odd fellow, politicians. Because Art was definitely not a millionaire kind of guy, but
yeah,
they had a good friendship, and Ron supported Art's work. When Art did international work, Ron was supportive of that. When Art had to go to Geneva and New York, Ron helped sponsor a lot of that work.
Wow.
So he's a decent guy. He's in his upper years now, but he's the only millionaire or multimillionaire I know that's an Indian. Not too many of those around. There's a few, but I don't know them.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we'll wrap it up, but can you tell us maybe really quickly how people, I think is it russdiabo.com is your website?
Yeah, that's my website. And I have some resources on there too.
Okay. And can you maybe just say a little bit about how people can get involved, or maybe what Idle No More might be doing right now, where people could connect with others?
Well, honestly, I don't know what Idle No More is doing.
I don't either.
I know they have websites, and they are involved in campaigns once in a while. So you can go to Idle No More and find the official national page, and usually on there they'll tell you if something's going on. There's I Don't Know More Ontario page, and I think they have an I Don't Know More BC page. So they got a bunch of different Facebook pages. But if people want to get involved in things, I guess, you know, you need to figure out who's being active. The Wet'suwet'en need a lot of support, you know. I would say anybody that can help the Wet'suwet'en out, you should help them out. Tiny House Warriors needs help. They're trying to block the Trans Mountain Pipeline up in Blue River. 1492 Land Back Lane at Six Nations, they're still out there doing land back stuff. So there are different groups out in Micmac country. You know, the fishers are kind of quiet now because it's not fishing season, but things will probably heat up again once fishing season starts out there. And, you know, they're pushing for exercising their treaty rights. Yeah. So there's different groups you can support across Canada that are active in doing things. I guess the last thing I should mention is I've been doing a newsletter for over the last 20 years. It's under the Electronic Collections of Libraries and Archives Canada. It's called the First Nations Strategic Bulletin. And I kind of started in 2002, so I kind of covered the last 20 years of policy. I don't put it out as much as I used to. I still put issues out, but if you look up First Nations Strategic Bulletin at Library and Archives Canada, you can find all of my past issues there. And I cover a lot of the history that I talked about tonight in those in the archive of newsletters that are there.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, my beautiful brother, Russ Diabo. You guys who are watching, be sure to share this out to your groups. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me on, and let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Russ.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Anagiwahi.
Ikose.